Welcome, everybody. My name's Robyn Mildon. I'm the CEO of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. Before we start, want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm normally on, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm actually in New Zealand tonight, so I also want to equally pay my respects to First Nations people in Aotearoa and pay my respects, acknowledging it always was and always will be Māori land. I am very excited for this webinar and the particular speaker we have, and very grateful for her time. Just as we enter into it, this is almost a teaser for a summit that we're holding in Melbourne, Australia, and online in October this year. And you can see some details about the summit in the slide next to Isabelle and I think. We are very, very lucky to have her joining us at the summit, and you can see the idea. So it's the Evidence and Implementation Summit, October 9th to 11th. We have wonderful co-hosts, Monash University and National University of Singapore. And you will get a little bit of a feel of, I think, in the next 45 minutes, what 3 days of action-packed thinking about how to improve the lives of vulnerable people can really do. So I'm going to introduce someone I met through our managing director in London, Jane Lewis, who instantly caught my attention and is just utterly delightful. So I don't want to set you up under any pressure as well, but I will introduce you a little bit. And I will also qualify, although I'm not a social work trained person, I have a long family history of social work. So I think my mother might even be joining this, who is a trained social worker. My grandmother graduated in the first group of social work graduates at University of British Columbia, and my partner is the head of social work at Monash. So I feel like we are one, but I think they're all downstairs watching. So let me introduce this wonderful person here. So since qualifying as a social worker from the London School of Economics, Isabelle has worked in the voluntary, statutory, and private sectors in a variety of practice and senior leadership roles. I want to skip a few things because I'm going to ask Isabelle to say a little bit more about herself, but she's currently the first chief social worker for England, Children and Families, in 2013 when she was appointed. Since then, she has been instrumental in the development and implementation of the government's strategy for reform for children's social care. She is a member of the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, and she sits on a ministerial-led Family Justice Board and Partners in Practice Governance Board, which just all sounds like you are the person to be talking about in terms of improving outcomes for children and families. So if you could say a little bit more about your background and how you've got to where you are now, and then I've got a couple of specific questions. Before we do that, for the audience, if you could post questions in the Q&A section, I'll be taking a little look at it. I'll be watching it we may not be able to answer all your questions, but I'll keep an eye on answering which we can. And at about the 45-minute mark, we'll take a screenshot of questions and we'll answer what we can't answer through email. So tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got here and why. And then I've got, as you know, a couple of specific questions.
Excellent. Well, hi, good morning, Robyn, and everybody else that's on the call, and thanks for joining us. So I'm a social worker, the clue's in the title, and have spent most of my career in inner city London running services for children and families. So in the UK, that's called children's social care. That tends to be child protection, services for looked after children, services for children, children with disabilities. And as you read, Robyn, I started in the 90s at London School of Economics, and I always tell this story, but on the first day of my training, I said, I shall never work in child protection, because I was so outraged by,
Really?
Yes, I went to see Ken Loach's film Lady Bird, Lady Bird, which you may or may not have seen. And I just thought, I can't do that. I just can't be that person, because it's about a social worker and their relationship with a particular family. And of course, I've pretty much done child protection and related things the whole of my career. And I think you often find that is that, you know, certain things grab you. And I've found it incredibly intellectually challenging, and yeah, I've had a you know, I'm very pleased, I suppose, that I've chosen to do this with my working life. And then about I suppose it must be 12 years ago that Professor Eileen Munro did a review into child protection, and I came out of my permanent role and was seconded into the Department for Education, and that was my first stint in government, and was part of her review team. And actually, I really hated it. I didn't know, I couldn't locate my place in the civil service at all, and in this department. And for me, there was just such a big gap between what I'd been doing for all those years locally and what the policy teams were doing in the civil service. It was just, you know, I couldn't locate myself in that. So I left that thinking, I'm never doing that again. And then they created the role of chief social worker. And I thought, okay, that maybe it was time to do something different and try and make a difference more broadly than the work that I'd done locally. And so I applied and I got the job, and I've been in it 10 years, which I just, you know, I can't believe. Although I was reading something that you wrote, Robyn, not so long ago, and it says that it takes at least 17 years to get evidence built into practice properly. And so I think I've still got I've got some time left.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's sort of pivot to that a little bit then. If you could highlight a couple of approaches that you've tried, or your colleagues have tried, or you've been involved in, that is really trying to improve the social care system in the UK, and a few lessons that could be applicable, because we've got an international audience here. But if you could just talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to talk a bit about how you change things locally vis-a-vis how you change things nationally, because it's very, very different. And, you know, this is a lot of the learning that I've had over the last 10 years. So if I talk a little about the work that I did in a local authority in London, Hackney, this is, you know, a few years ago, where we were running a children's social care system. It was really, really dysfunctional on so many levels, and families just were not getting the service that they needed. That we were working with between 2,000 and 3,000 children at any one time. We had massive problems with recruitment and retention, huge agency rates of up to 80% in some teams, 50% overall. And it was just really, really hard work for the service, and families were not getting what they needed. So we embarked on, you know, what I describe as a whole system change, where we took a really, you know, radical step away from the orthodoxy and how things were usually done. And, you know, looking back on it now, we might come back to this, to talk about this a bit more. But it was a sort of really embryonic attempt to draw in some of the common elements from the evidence-based programs that were, you know, very much up and coming in those years. So, you know, we're talking about 2005, something like that, where, you know, it was in my head, it was the sort of golden age of evidence-based programs. It was kind of quite exciting. They were all coming through. So things like all the, you know, parenting programs, Webster Stratton, Triple P, MST, all those sorts of things. And so we really tried to draw down the best of those programs, and then develop our workforce according to quite a different knowledge and skill that had been seen in children's social care before. And we did loads and loads of things, and we were very, very successful, it has to be said. And we, reduced our children coming into care by about 40%. We had absolutely no agency problem, recruitment and retention problem at all. In fact, we had waiting lists for people who wanted to come in and work for us. And we created kind of completely different sort of culture of practice, very family focused. And obviously that was why I then, ended up in the Monroe review team and probably got this job, because I'd sort of helped make this transformation in a system which really seemed stuck in how it was working with families. Do you want to say me a bit more about the learning from that, or do you want to give another example? Or
yes, please. No, go ahead with the learnings. I will qualify a little bit for the. Not everyone will quite understand what the common elements idea is. So, just for a few folks on the webinar, there's a continuum of trying to improve the use of evidence in policy and practice, and some are through very structured programs, and some are through clinical guidelines, and some are through very common elements that make up a lot of these programs. Acknowledging that each of these still needs to be monitored, evaluated, and tested for their impact. So that's just the reference to the common elements approach. But go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things, I discovered this later on, and it really sort of the end of that story, that local story, was the start of a much bigger story about the importance of evaluation and evidence, because one of the things that we couldn't really explain was what made the difference. We did all these things, and we came out of it several years later. And obviously people were watching what we were doing, and policymakers were really interested, and we just kept saying, oh, it was everything. You have to do everything. Yeah. But actually we didn't know. And even though we had, some very, prominent people doing evaluations around our practice. So in fact, Eileen Monroe did an evaluation from London School of Economics. Professor Donald Forrester did a review from, he was at Goldsmiths at that time. But it was not possible because of the way that we'd set up the evaluation to really determine what the catalyst for change was. And that's obviously always a kind of ongoing problem for people. So you can create, it doesn't have to be a big whole system change. It can be a small project, but if you want to replicate, then that's a sort of age-old challenge, isn't it? It's about how you do that. Yeah. And so I wish we'd done more on that, but we were very busy. And it was, we knew we had to do the evaluation, but it wasn't our priority. So, and I think the other really massive learning from that for me was, and I think I wish I'd been a bit kinder to some of the workforce, because we were pretty ruthless in who we had working for us. And of course, what I discovered was that when you change a practice system in a way which really supports practice, then practitioners that might have been really struggling just transform, and they really flourish. And that was the biggest learning for me. And that I saw practitioners that I had, thought there's no way that you should be doing this work, change into something completely brilliant, where I'm just thinking of one person in particular who would get really glowing reports from, professionals in the court system because she became an amazing social worker. So that's a huge learning. It's something that I really carry with me, I suppose, through the work that I've done nationally.
Can I ask you a couple of things? So, and then there's a really good question already in the Q&A that I'm gonna reference. But what hasn't worked
in that instance, in that local instance?
Or
yeah, well, I suppose from my perspective is that we couldn't scale it.
Right.
And that was the, you know, that was the big problem, I think. And I mean, it's hard for me to answer that question about what didn't work, because it worked incredibly well. That was a, you know, it was a very sort of unusual set of circumstances. And I think that children and families locally got a much better service from us, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve. I think that, you know, there was some real tensions because of the way that we were changing how people work. There was a lot more conversation built, sort of hardwired into the system. So we had a lot of, you know, very talented people, not just social workers, quite a multidisciplinary workforce, which is quite unusual for children's social care. That we had expectations that there was a lot of conversation about what was happening to practice. So this is way beyond the sort of traditional linear model of supervision. But there were points where I think that I had to step in and say, can you just stop talking and do and act? So that, you know, there's a sort of risk when you create those types of practice environments, which are deeply and endlessly interesting for people when they get an opportunity to talk. At some point, you have to kind of cut to the chase and make some decisions and act. So it's trying to get the balance right, I think, between those two things.
Yeah, utterly. And sometimes the urgency is pretty real, isn't it? Particularly for the sort of children and families that are supported by the workforce that you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, I think that you know, leads me on to talk a bit about what's happened and what we've tried to do nationally. Because when I went into this role in 2013, and I've said a little about my first experience of the civil service, this time around I have really loved it, and I have found my place, and I've worked out a way to survive and operate. I mean, for another piece of work, I worked under 10 secretaries of state and 7 children's ministers, and you know, so I have managed to develop a way of working which can suit a very, very different range of ministers and policymakers. But when I arrived in Whitehall, I was really, I suppose, shocked about who it was that was influencing who was influencing policy most, and it tended to be the lobbyists. So you know, the third sector, so you know, big charity sector, other lobbyists, academics, employers, but very, very little practice voice. In fact, practitioners hardly got a look in, and the family voice certainly didn't. And this felt really fundamentally wrong to me. So I think that one of the things that I have tried to do over these years is to get the focus back onto practice, and by that I mean the fundamental interaction between practitioner and family. You know, what's actually happening within that interaction that's going to be helpful. And that's been my mantra, I suppose. And if you looked at our overall policy arrangement, you will see that as often as I could, I got practice in the title, because I just wanted people to keep on thinking that this is about practice, and that in our world, there are so many possible and sometimes unavoidable distractions, that you have to really kind of keep trying to pull the system towards what matters most. And again, I think that's the practice. And so, you know, there's a lot of conversation about what did you do? Actually, particularly in those early years, I spent a lot of time trying to stop people doing things. So, and you know, it's the kind of tyranny of good ideas. Everyone's got a good idea, But actually, if you, and you know, there's the sort of general culture of quick fixes, etc., and wanting to be seen to be doing things. And that's that's a very entrenched culture, and trying to shift that and just shift politicians, policymakers away from doing very small things that they think will make a difference, but actually they just tie up practitioners in complete knots, and to no advantage for children and families. So that's a lot of what I did actually in the first few years. And then from about 2014 up to today, there's been a huge amount of work on finding out what's the most effective practice. And right from the beginning, we set up an innovation program. From then till about 2020, we've spent 300 million on testing new ideas in children's social care. Now that was just virtually unheard of in our arena, because even though our work to us is very important, we're a very small part of the public sector, and to get that kind of investment in practice has just been phenomenal. And you know, I can talk as much as you want about that, because that's, you know, been a huge journey for us. But it's been really fundamental to how we've changed the perspective about what we should be doing to help children and families.
So that's good. So that's a good segue, and I'm getting some nice questions in the Q&A, which I get the fun job of trying to curate. But there's a question there around, and people that have worked with CI or have talked with us before know that we are pretty clear, and the research is pretty clear, that training by itself of a workforce is insufficient to get the change that we need, and often the thing that happens, right? So ministers,
absolutely,
how many people should we train? How many people did you train? But it doesn't enable the effect. And we keep doing, in your country and in Australia and a lot of the countries that CI work in, we keep doing the same things. There's a nice question here around, in addition to training, where, and hopefully there's some evaluation evidence to show that things worked, because that's the other kind of, we can hope that things work, but we also want to sort of show that things worked and why they worked and how they worked. But in addition to training, what other supports, where you feel like, or where you have some data to show things were getting better, what other implementation infrastructure was put in place, if any? Okay, so and it's a great question, and I totally agree that, and I've had many arguments with people who just want to do a training program, because I absolutely know that it won't work. And it's so this is why, you know, I believe in this, in what, you know, I describe as a whole system shift. They're all really obvious things, I suppose, but whether it's a local system or a national system, I think that what you're trying to do is create the tram lines within which people can work. So you have to, and it's trying to get this balance between prescription and flex and local context. Yeah, so you've got to get that balance right. So I think that we've through the innovation program, basically I think there's probably about over 100 programs that we set off running, and over time we've got that down to probably about 5, maybe 8 programs that we think that were evaluated, you know, very well, that we think have got a strong evidence base, that we had a sort of an emerging evidence base. We rolled it out further. We got more sophisticated in the way that we were evaluating these things. And so over time, we've got this cluster of approaches, I suppose I'd say, that do demonstrate that if you have that framework for practice in place in your local area, then good things happen. Now,
it's contentious, isn't it? It's about, well, what does that mean? So in England, we have an inspection regime. The number of authorities that are inadequate or requires improvement has really radically shifted, and that we have far fewer authorities that are inadequate. We have a declining number of children going into care. So our overall care numbers keep going up, but that's because children tend to stay for longer once they're in the care system.
Is that because kids aren't leaving?
Exactly. But actually from 2017, so that's about 3 years into the innovation programme, you started to see this decline of new entrants, because one of the common elements, I suppose, of all the programs that we've invested in is the need for a family focus. So still, child's best interest, but within family context, and the importance of the relationships around those children. And that has held us in very, very good stead. Back to the original question, which is training won't cut it. It absolutely won't. So again, many through these years, and many authorities have now developed what they would describe as their practice framework. So their approach to working, the principles that they want to adopt in their practice, particular practice methodologies. Obviously, there is a training element, but it's the ongoing rigor and support that you provide those practitioners that I think really makes the difference. So evidence can be very neutral, can't it? But I'm pretty sure that you need a specific value base in order to make progress for children and families, and that has to be kind of hardwired, again, using that word, into pretty much everything that you do. We always talk about leadership. The strength of leadership is absolutely crucial. You need leaders that stay. A leader staying for a couple of years when you're trying to transform anything is just useless. People really believe in this stuff, then you're looking at 5 years minimum to really kind of get something going that has a chance of being sustained once you move away. And in our area, I think the importance of leaders being close to practice is absolutely crucial. So anybody that wants to move into management or leadership because they want to get away from practice, it's going to be a miserable experience, in my view, because you lose the connection with, again, what's most important. And so I think that the most successful systems, way beyond training, is your senior leaders totally engaged in practice and who see their key role as making life as easy as possible for practitioners who are working with the families that need their help. So all those things, as well as
all those things. There's a lot, and there's some amazing questions coming in, which now I'm worried we're not going to have time. So I'm going to try and group a couple. There's a couple of themes about some lived experience, children and family voice, which I'm going to come to because I think that really needs to be sort of discussed. I also want to just ask, there's a couple of themes around what was the practice framework used, and what is the cluster of 5 or 6 to 8 programs being used that got solid evidence? And there's a number of questions about that, and I'm going to put you on the spot there a little bit.
That's okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Go ahead on that first one, then I'll come back to a couple of two.
Okay, and you're going to ask me the question about lived experience?
I am. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
There's the voices of children and families, and then there's another theme around disconnect with local authority and central government policy making, which I'll go third. So if you go the first one, then I'll prompt you.
Okay, yeah. So so as I said before, there are lots of most local authorities will have what they call a practice framework. So right now they are many and varied.
Yeah.
What we're doing in England for the first time is developing a statutory practice framework. So I chair something called the National Practice Group. It has a range of key players around the table, including from other agencies that we've just been out to consultation on that statutory framework. And for the first time, there's a lot of work to do on it to get this right. But for the first time, in a very, well, if ever actually, we will be trying to draw down on the evidence that we have gained over those last few years and build it into this framework. So, and one of the new things that we've done is that so children's social care can be so many things to so many different people, and that's part of its problem. It's lacked clarity of purpose, I think. That the framework that we've just consulted on has just got four outcomes, and that in itself gives us a very specific focus on keeping families together. I don't want to say too much about that. The 5 to 8 programs that they are, we ran a program over time. We got to 3 major whole system change programs. You probably won't recognise the titles, but there's family safeguarding, which is heavily focused on multidisciplinary practice about how you change parental behaviour. So too often we think we're just focusing on the child, and that's just like a non-starter. If you want to change things for children, you have to change things for parents. Family Valued, which is a practice framework based on restorative justice and restorative principles. And then something called No Wrong Door, which is very much focused on, it is a whole system change programme, but at the core of it is how we move children through institutional care and out into family context.
So most of the Australian audience here would be familiar with all 3. They might have different names, but there's been many attempts.
Yeah, and we've got good evidence. I'm only smiling because I know I'm very I'm very cautious about sitting with something.
Somebody going to post it in the chat?
I'm told we have very good evidence. But we have for people that are listening and are interested, we have a What Works Centre, which has just changed its name to Foundations. You'll find all the evaluations of those programmes there. The other things that I just wanted to flag, which are, I think, really exciting, is Mockingbird, which some of you will know, which is a support system for foster carers. We've got good evidence on how that helps establish permanency for children in care. We have something called Lifelong Links, which is a programme which is working with children in the care system and drawing in networks of relationships from their own family, extended family, professional groups who commit to lifelong support for that child whose relationships have been shattered over time. We've just also published an RCT in family group conferencing, which I know that a lot of people will recognise on this webinar, but again, that's extremely positive. And then I just want to mention 2 other things. So we've done a lot of evaluation. Some things don't work that we wish had worked. And there's 2 that spring to mind. So we did the What Works. I say we, I'm a founder member of the What Works Centre that I'm talking about. We did an evaluation of signs of safety. and it was very negative. And that was a big shock to people that had used it as the fundamental approach as part of its practice framework, and still does. There are, many authorities that use signs of safety. So that didn't go down very well. And another one that we've just published, which is another RCT, was having social workers in schools, which felt like a natural, sort of instinctive, positive thing to do, makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. And again, that was a big disappointment for some people. So it just gives you a flavour of, and out of those 100+ programs that we originally set off, most of them didn't work, and that's why we were so privileged, I think, to be given license to spend money on things that actually failed, but it answered lots of questions for us that we had in that policy landscape.
And I really appreciate you saying that on this webinar, because there's no place for people to publish things that don't work, as you know.
Yeah.
And reports often commissioned by government in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and Singapore don't get, don't see the light of day. So I really appreciate, particularly in your role, you naming a couple of things that didn't work, because it's just as important as hearing about the things that
it is absolutely. And what I'd say about that is that the National Audit Office, which is something that people are usually scared of, who come and crawl all over your work and look at value of public money, that they looked at the work that we've done over the last few years. There's a report that you can look at and it does a case study of the work that we've done, and what one of the things that it says is that we published over 100 reports, and that they really identify the fact that we published those and were willing to to sort of air not just the things that didn't work, but actually how weak some of our own evaluation was over the years. Just really helps, I think, the whole agenda, and that we shouldn't be afraid of failing and things not working, as long as you kind of learn and move on from that.
I'm going to plant an idea with you, and then we need to talk about the lived experience stuff. But there's a nice comment from someone towards the end of the chat who we both know, because sometimes when we're thinking about things that work and support for implementation, and we can't totally get into this now because I want to make sure we answer this other question, but is it sometimes the innovation or the approach that didn't work, or is it the support for implementation that meant that the thing didn't work? And that's quite a important conversation to have maybe at the summit, because sometimes things that were really good didn't work because the support for implementation, going back to the training plus model, wasn't there, and it could have worked, versus no matter how good the implementation support is, the thing may never have worked. And I think that's some of your comments has some of the audience thinking a little bit about that. We've got 5 minutes left, and I really want to I'm just going to read this verbatim. How is the child voice and family voice now better positioned to influence, given it wasn't when you started? That's in brackets. And what does this look like now? And what does the longitudinal research capture about the child research lens show? So I suppose that the upshot of the question is, what sort of thinking or work are you doing? So if you think about the ultimate definition of evidence-informed practice, it's the best research that fits the context and what people need, that it's meant to be certain, and people's values and beliefs. So I think that question's getting to that a little bit. This might be, go ahead.
So let me say a couple of things about that. So my view is that, and in England, I think we're quite good at representing the child's voice, particularly children that are in care. So we have, 20, 30 years more of bringing that child's voice into our thinking and decision making. And we have structures in place which make that happen. So the fact that we've got independent reviewing officers, we've got statutory advocacy services, we've got the role of the guardian in the court system. You know, there are a range of things that make that happen. I think that there is much more work to do on family voice. I think we have absolutely made progress, and that in the department now, so for example, we've just launched a sort of refreshed reform strategy called Stable Homes Built on Love. We have an implementation board, and we have family voice on that board. Now, for me, and these are not organizations, these are individuals. That's different. Yeah, that's a real step forward. I think that the frameworks that we've talked quite a lot about, the practice frameworks, they are I think the most successful ones are family focused. And for me, that means bringing the family voice into your thinking and decision making at a strategic level. So I think that there is more of that. We know that the work that we do is deeply private. So there is that, you know, there's that real problem that families don't want to participate in the way that we might like them to. But there are ways of doing it. And I think the concept of family justice is stronger as a result of the work that we have done. And yeah, the sort of the deal between state and family is a really important one. And I think that you know, many of us who are involved in the reform agenda, you know, want to make sure that there's a better deal.
Well, that is a very nice way to end that, if not a huge call to action. So there was far more questions than we could answer then. So if I could make sure one of the team has captured them so we can answer what we can. Those of you that are here, we had over 460 registrations or something like that for this. So we will be putting this up on the EIS website for people to watch later. I appreciate your time very much. We are so looking forward to having you at the event in October. We're going to keep you very busy. So folks can register now, and you can come back to me or anyone on the summit team or Isabelle's office with any questions. But again, thanks everyone for attending in the funny hours that we're in right now, and appreciate your time so much. Brilliant.
Thanks very much, Robyn.